You thought the fall of Rome was inevitable? No. Just one day, Rome didn't fall. And from that, all of Europe was rewritten like a domino effect. It begins on an ordinary morning that should not matter. A courier rides through fog toward Ravenna, where the Western court has become a nervous heart beating behind marshes and walls. The message in his satchel is not poetry, not prophecy, not a miracle. It is a ledger and a set of seals, numbers, names, and an order. In our timeline, the West is already leaning over the edge. Armies are expensive, loyalty is rented. Emperors rise and fall like coins tossed onto a table. Frontier peoples are not just enemies, they are labor, soldiers, bargaining chips. The system is tired, and tired systems don't collapse with a single blow. They unravel. But today, the unraveling pauses. Inside the palace, a decision is made that seems small compared to the scale of empire. The government stops pretending it can fund survival with tricks. No more emergency debasement that turns silver into rumor. No more late payments that force generals to collect their wages from the countryside like bandits in uniform. No more private deals that make the army loyal to commanders instead of the state. A reset is ordered. Taxes are recalculated, yes, but the real shock is where the burden lands. The great estates, the men who have grown fat behind paperwork and influence, are finally pulled into the net. Not with speeches, but with enforcement. The imperial agents arrive with soldiers and clerks. Registers are updated, exemptions are revoked. The message is blunt. The state will not starve while the richest provinces hide behind privilege. This is the first domino, because the next domino is military. A reform is announced that terrifies ambitious generals. Command is rotated on a schedule, and the payroll is centralized under inspectors who report directly to the court. Veterans are promised land, but not in chaotic grabs that create mini warlords. Instead, land is assigned in organized colonies along vulnerable corridors, tied to service obligations and protected by law. The empire is buying something priceless: predictability. Now comes the dangerous part: the frontier peoples. In our history, barbarians are invited in, recruited, paid, betrayed, used, feared, then blamed when the roof collapses. In this alternate day, the empire does something colder and smarter. It makes them Roman. Not in a sentimental way, in a transactional, legal, enforceable way. Federate treaties are rewritten into a ladder of citizenship. Serve for a set term, settle under Roman law, marry under Roman law, pay taxes under Roman law, and you are no longer a temporary ally. You are a stakeholder. Your children inherit status, not suspicion. The empire is not letting outsiders in. It is absorbing manpower into its bloodstream before the body bleeds out. That is domino number 3. And suddenly, the West has something it has been losing for a century: a future it can plan. This doesn't create a golden age overnight. It creates something less glamorous and more powerful: continuity. Roads remain patrolled. Ports remain taxed. Grain shipments arrive more reliably. Coinage becomes boring again. Boring is good, because boring means trust. Cities don't go dark all at once. Imagine a merchant in Arles or Milan or Tarraco. In our timeline, he learns to live smaller, to trade locally, to accept that long-distance commerce is dying. In this timeline, he still hears Latin in the courthouse. He still signs contracts that mean something beyond the next town. He still trusts that a dispute can be settled without hiring a private militia. That changes what people build. When the rules keep working, investment returns. Workshops stay open. Skilled labor stays in cities rather than fleeing into the countryside. Education remains a tool of administration, not a luxury of monasteries. And yes, monasteries still rise. Religion does not vanish. But the church grows in the shadow of a functioning state, not in the vacuum of a fallen one. Here comes another domino: the balance between throne and altar. In our history, the Western Church becomes a substitute for imperial infrastructure. Bishops become administrators because someone has to be. Popes become diplomatic powers because someone must negotiate with kings who replaced governors. In this timeline, the Church still gains influence, People still crave certainty, community, salvation, but it negotiates with a living empire that refuses to be replaced. That means fewer moments where Europe's future is decided by who can crown whom. It also means something stranger. Fewer borders harden early. The West does not fracture into a patchwork as fast. Some regions become highly autonomous. Rome must compromise to survive. But autonomy inside a Roman legal umbrella is different from independent kingdoms. Instead of dozens of competing states inventing new rules, you get a looser imperial federation, a Roman world that is less absolute but harder to kill. Now shift the camera forward. Centuries later, travelers still call the Mediterranean a connected sea, not a broken frontier. That single fact changes everything. Because a connected sea is a highway for ideas, goods, and disease, but also for resilience. And then the 7th century arrives. The Arab conquests explode across the Near East and North Africa in our timeline, reshaping the world. In this alternate world, the outcome is not guaranteed. A stronger Western state changes the strategic map. Maybe it supports the East with ships and taxes. Maybe it keeps North Africa more tightly integrated, making it harder to lose suddenly. Maybe it forces a longer, bloodier struggle along coasts and deserts. Here's the key. Even if the new powers still rise, they rise into a world where the Roman system hasn't vanished in the West. Trade networks don't simply transfer, they contest. Diplomacy becomes more complex. Cultural borders blur differently. The Mediterranean remains contested, but not surrendered. Now comes the domino most people want: technology and progress. Does this world invent modern science early? Not automatically. Stability preserves knowledge, yes, but competition accelerates change. In our timeline, fragmented Europe becomes a pressure cooker. Rival states sponsor ships, cannons, and maps because losing means being conquered. A surviving Roman federation could slow that race, or it could redirect it. Instead of sending dozens of small kingdoms into the Atlantic on desperate gambles, you might see a bigger, richer imperial system focusing on the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and routes into Africa and Asia. Exploration still happens, but it might look like state logistics rather than private adventurers. It might be later or earlier, but less chaotic. The age of discovery becomes an administrative project, not a frantic competition. Languages change too. Latin doesn't remain frozen, but it stays prestigious longer. Regional Romance languages still emerge, yet they develop under continuous schooling, law, and bureaucracy. They end up closer to one another, more standardized, more mutually readable. Contracts, courts, and education keep pulling speech toward a shared center. And then you notice the most unsettling domino of all. To survive, Rome has to stop being Rome. The old Roman identity was built on hierarchy: citizen over non-citizen, Roman over outsider, center over frontier. But the empire that survives is an empire that compromises. It spreads citizenship wider. It shares power with provincial elites. It tolerates local autonomy. It becomes, in practice, a federation of Romanness rather than a single Roman core. So you get a world where Rome never fell, but Rome is transformed into something new, something that doesn't collapse in 476 because it no longer depends on the fragile idea that only one kind of person can be Roman. And that is the final twist. The most realistic timeline where Rome never falls is not a timeline where Rome stays perfect. It is a timeline where Rome survives by surrendering some of what made it feel eternal. Now return to that morning in Ravenna. The courier's message was not a sword, not a prophecy, not a battle. It was a reform with teeth, a tax reset, a military payroll that cannot be stolen, a legal ladder that turns enemies into citizens. One day, one chain reaction, and a world that wakes up centuries later, looking at Europe and realizing the ruins never came. Not because history became kinder, but because the empire learned, just barely in time, how to bend instead of break.